So what if I told you, you don't have to sit alone in grief anymore? This is Natasha Smith, and you are listening to the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. Welcome back to the Can You Just Sit With Me podcast. I am your host, Natasha Smith, and I am beyond excited about our guest today. Recognized as one of today's foremost experts on grief, Claire Bidwell Smith is a licensed therapist, international speaker, and the author of 5 books published in 22 countries. We will chat about her own experience in grief, her work in hospice and private practice, and her latest book, Conscious Grieving. Come and sit with us and join the conversation. So hello, Claire. I am so excited just to be sitting with you here today. And so we're just going to get started and jump right in. So just tell us about a moment when you wanted to ask someone the question, can you just sit with me?
I love this question so much. I love this prompt. The first thing I thought of with this question was right after my mother died. I was 18. I was a freshman in college and went home from college after she died. And my best friend, who we were at different schools, just came and she slept with me in my bed for like nights, through that week of the funeral and all the things that we had to do. And I kind of asked, but also didn't have to ask, but she knew to just sit with me. There was nothing she could do to fix it or change it, but she was just there and it meant the world to me. I still think about it to this day.
Wow. Such a powerful story and rare, right? In the
Yeah.
culture and society we live in, that is so rare. So that is so beautiful. And you touched on it a little bit, just saying the loss of your mom.
Mhm.
So can you just take us back or just tell us your story and how it informs your new book, Conscious Grieving?
Yeah. So both of my parents got cancer at the same time when I was 14. And my mother died while I was a college freshman. And my dad died 7 years later when I was 25. And I'm an only child, so I lost my whole little immediate family, entered into young adulthood with no family, really, and it was really hard. I was just grieving and going through so much at a time when all of my peers were in a really different place in life. They were like hanging out in new apartments and new jobs and relationships. And I was like, what is life about? And I was deeply sad and anxious. And it took me a good many years to really kind of move through a lot of my grief. And I did so with the help of therapy and yoga and all the things. And when I came through it, I realized that I really wanted to work in that field. So I got my master's in clinical psychology and became a therapist. And I worked in hospice initially, and I've now been in private practice for, almost 15 years. Just finished my 5th book, which sounds like too many books. They're all about grief, much to my children's dismay. They're like, what's this one about, Mom? Grief again. Yeah, but this one's called Conscious Grieving.
Yes, and I have it, and I'm like, why am I just realizing all the beautiful work that you've done? So this is your 5th book, and you're doing such beautiful, needed, necessary work in our world
Thank you.
across the globe today. And I came across your work on Instagram, so I'm like, thank you, social media. And so for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about your work as a therapist and then just maybe some surprising things that you've learned about grief?
Yeah, absolutely. I specialize in grief, so I really only see people who are going through loss. But loss is so variable, right? I
Yeah.
have people that come to me for the loss of a pet, or even people who've come in to see me for the loss of a career that's ended, or a marriage, losing a home to a fire. We grieve for so many things. And I think what I've learned about grief, I went into this work thinking I knew a lot about grief and really quickly realized that I only knew my grief.
Yeah.
And it can look so different for so many people. I feel like that's sometimes hard to hear. We want grief to be formulaic. We kind of want it to be a one size fits all so that we can know how to move through it. But the truth is, there's so many things that impact the grief process. Our relationship with the person we lost, our place in life at the moment, the way the person died. There's so many different things that really come into play with the grief process. But what I've learned more than anything is that what's important is to lean into it. Grief is something we will all experience in our lives. We start grieving early on in life, even if we don't recognize it necessarily as such. We grieve pets and teachers we say goodbye to, and homes we lived in, and parents getting divorced. And it's something we know how to do. It's something we really can embrace, and we can learn so much about ourselves and the world and relationships when we lean into it rather than run away from it. And for a long time, our culture has really looked at grief as like this thing that we need to get through and get over. It's like a bad thing. It's an affliction. But really, I think grief has so much to teach us. It's hard. It's so hard. It's so painful. It's scary sometimes. But ultimately, I think it has a lot to teach us. And I think that there's a lot of positive ways to kind of embrace it, to learn from it, to find ways to support yourself through it. And I think that's really the message of this book and of my work. It's, don't run away from it. Don't look at it as this terrible thing. It's really hard, again, but it's something we know how to do.
That's so powerful and such a needed message. Part of my story is that I sat with grief for 30 years, like not knowing what to do with it, pushing it to the side, just not dealing with it.
Yeah.
And so when I hear people who have suffered a loss and they're like, oh, I'm going to therapy next week. I'm like, good for you. Yay. They lean into it. I'm like, oh, if I had only,
because it doesn't go anywhere, right? Like you sat with it for 30 years because if you push it away and don't lean into it, it just waits for you.
Yeah, it waits for you. Oh my gosh. So that is just so good and so powerful. I love, love, love the structure of this book, how, and from one, when I was reading through it and looking through it, it just can be used in so many different ways. And so whether it's teaching, a studying tool, educationally, individually, as a group, just so many ways, right? And as a desk reference for everything grief, like it's literally, it feels like it has everything in it. So what did you have in mind, like for readers, in structuring the book in this way?
I mostly really wanted it to be reassuring, and have a lot of information. And it has a ton of information, but there's also like little bite-sized pieces all throughout. So you can kind of flip through it or flip around in it. Grief is overwhelming to begin with, so you don't need a book that's overwhelming too. And so I just wanted it to be something where you could just find like a comforting voice or also some practical tools. When we go through a significant loss, it's like we've been dropped onto a different planet, right? Everything is different. The whole world can look different. Sometimes we go through immense changes in our lives, resources, we lose our homes or financial hardship, or we're unable to go back to work. All kinds of things can happen that are impacted by the loss. And a lot of people don't recognize that, how hard it is to pick yourself up and be able to go back to a job, or lose, a person in your family who provided half the finances. There's so much. So grief can just be a very disorienting experience. And so the structure is kind of about, we enter into grief. We didn't ask for it, didn't invite it, but here we are and we're in it. So that section's really about like stabilizing, kind of understanding where you are, how to kind of help yourself in those moments that feel so disorienting. And then the next section is engaging with grief. And that's about, how do we kind of start to lean into it, right? We talk about leaning into it, but what does that really look like? What are some tools to use for that? What happens when we get scared or we want to avoid it? Where are the resources we need for it? And then the third section is surrendering to grief. And that's really about, surrender is an interesting word and we toss it around a lot. And it's a little bit about kind of just surrendering to the fact that this is happening, like this, that you have gone through this loss. It doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean you're okay that this person is gone, but it means that you are surrendering to the idea that you're going to carry this grief and this loss with you. And then the last section is transforming through grief, which is really about all the ways we grow when we go through a loss, whether we like it or not. I know it's hard to hear when you're in the beginning of a big loss. You don't want to hear about transforming or any of the pretty stuff, or like that you may actually grow and expand and transform. You just want your person back. But we do change a lot, and we do learn things about ourselves and the world.
So what you call those is the four orientations of conscious
Mm-hmm.
grieving, right?
Yeah.
And so you just explained those to us. Why do you think that these are important for the griever to know? Like for me, it was so cool because familiar with like the stages of grief and or different theories, but this was to me different. Like it was more softer to grasp.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. I
why do
mean,
you think
there's
it's
so
important?
many theories out there and so many ideas, and so many of them are really helpful, but often, it's you kind of end up picking and choosing from them. Or what happens is that people try to fit their process into a model and it doesn't fit. So then they get confused, or they
Yeah.
feel like they're doing something wrong, or they feel ashamed of not meeting some kind of goal that doesn't quite work. So I just wanted to kind of talk about these four orientations where you're orienting yourself to this new landscape of grief. And there's no timeline, there's no formula. We want there to be a timeline. We want there to be a formula. When we are in so much anguish and pain and we don't know how we're going to be in our lives without somebody, we want there to be like, tell me how long this is going to last.
Yeah.
Tell me what to do. What are the four, steps? And it doesn't really work that way. But I do, in all these years of the work I've done, I've sat with every kind of loss. And I see a progression of grief. The first 6 months, the first year are really, really hard. You're kind of trying to survive, you're getting oriented to this new process. Grief can be an experience unlike anything you've ever been through in your life. When you lose somebody really significant, you may have never experienced the kind of emotions that you do when you go through that kind of loss. And so just kind of getting acquainted with yourself even in that first year is a big process. And then a lot of grief we carry for our lives. I'm not actively mourning my parents. I'm 45 years old now. My mom's been gone for 27 years, but I miss her and I think about her every day. And there are moments in my life when the grief kind of comes up. I have 3 kids that she never got to meet. And there will be moments like my daughter graduated middle school last year, and just standing there and just feeling that grief that, wow, they never got to have their grandparents here. So some grief is something that we will carry forever. And how do we learn to do that? How do we make space for that? There's a lot to kind of really think about. And I hope that the book really outlines a lot of just how to hold that grief.
Yeah. Um, and just your words that you just used, just the learning aspect of it,
Mhm.
because grieving is a lot of learning. And you mentioned even about like the brain science,
Mhm.
um, and just that like grieving is a learning process.
Yeah, it really is. Like there's been a lot of really interesting new studies in brain science and grief lately. And what essentially they say is that our brains are learning a new way to be in the world without our person. And it takes a lot of work. People will talk about brain fog or exhaustion and grief, like they can't remember what room they just came out of or what they were going to do, in the next hour. And it's because there's just so much going on in our brains and our hearts all at once. You lose somebody like a parent or a spouse or a child, it takes so much time for you to begin to really process the fact that they're physically gone. It's not something you just accept overnight. And so your brain and your heart and your nervous system are working double time to really kind of, catch up to the reality of what's happening.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's so important for like your book just helps in every area and aspect of grief. So my prayer is that everyone who is listening will grab a copy of it, because I feel like it's that initial resource that everyone who is experiencing a loss needs. Like it's something that you need by your nightstand, and something that you need when you're taken to the beach, wherever. If you're
Thank you.
grieving, like
Yeah.
seriously, so you can open it up and say, "Oh," especially like I love the little just even the list that you have,
Mhm.
whether, how I'm feeling. Okay, yep.
Yeah.
I'm normal. I'm doing good.
Yeah, I wanted there to be so much reassurance in the book
Yes.
because
Yes.
so I can't tell you how many of my clients think they're doing it wrong. They're one of
Mhm.
the biggest things they say to me in sessions, especially in the beginning when they come in for the first time, is they're like, I think I'm grieving wrong. I think I'm doing this wrong. I'm stuck, or I'm crying too much, or I'm not crying, or I skipped a stage.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to normalize a lot of the process in the book.
So well done. It's so good. It's so good. Um, and so, of course, grief is hard. There's no doubt about it. Sometimes it's hard to see past just that fact of just how hard it is right now. You kind of touched on this already. Um, so, what do you say to people those who are listening, who can't see or believe that there is a other side?
Hmm. I think just getting really present, taking things day by day, hour by hour, really asking for support. You don't need to believe that there's another side to it yet. You just need to survive
Oh,
the moment, and I think really no one should grieve alone. Like we really need support, but grief support is strange. Like your question and your show and everything this is about, all you need to do for someone who's in grief is just show up and sit with them. There's nothing you can say that's going to fix it or necessarily make them feel better, but your presence is so important. I think about the word companion a lot. Like, just be a
mhm.
companion to someone in grief, just be there with them. And so, when you're in that deep grief, find somebody who can just show up and be there with you. Sometimes that's an unexpected person. Sometimes even our own family members can't show up in the way that we need. And we may meet somebody who's also gone through a loss, or we may go to a grief support group or something like that. And you meet people who just get it and they can show up for you. So find someone who can be there and sit with you. But you don't have to necessarily believe that it's going to get better one day. You just need to get through these moments.
Mm.
Grief comes in like waves, and sometimes those waves will knock you to the floor in the middle of the grocery store. A song will come on and your knees will buckle and you will be on the floor. And it's a wave of grief, and you ride it, you lean into it, you cry, eventually you get up, you finish whatever you're doing, and then you wait for the next wave. And so in the beginning of that really deep grief, it's really just about minute by minute, hour by hour, finding someone there to hold your hand, as you ride those waves.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So for yourself, because I love the idea, of course, the power of presence and sitting with others. I love that you literally sit with people, in your
Mhm.
in your line of work. So how, like for yourself, like with the loss that you experience, how has this been like a learning process as you went along? Like how did you kind of come to this point where you've grown in
Yeah.
and out of this of grief?
Well, like you, I've really tried to push it away for a while in the beginning. And a lot of that too is because no one around me was supporting me or recognizing it. My friends were like, just didn't get it. They couldn't really show up for it. And the adults around me were like, you're fine, just move on. You had them until, you were 20 something, you're good. And so I listened to those kind of messages and thought, well, I have to get better and I have to just move forward. But that wasn't the answer, because in doing that, I was really pushing away this grief I needed to sit with. And I eventually began to find ways to sit with it. And that was going to therapy and finding someone who could really help me sit with the pain because it was so overwhelming. Yoga and meditation, I know those can be eye rolling and annoying to hear, but they serve so much in grief because we really need to be able to sit with ourselves,
Yeah.
sit with that pain. And meditation, I think, is an amazing thing to do. Get an app, get a guided thing, like
Yeah.
whatever. But when we're grieving, we're spending all this time in the past thinking about what happened and what led up to it. And we're spending all this time in the future feeling afraid of what life is going to be like. So anything you can do to bring yourself back to that present moment and that kind of just being aware of yourself is so helpful. And when I started to really discover all of those tools, I really started to heal. And when I did, I kind of came through on the other side as this person with like so much compassion, so much curiosity about the world, really wanting to help others, serve others, just be, there's so many people who are suffering. And I had some bleak moments where I was like, I don't even know why I'm here. And when I began to like kind of just give of myself, I felt so much better. And so I still do that in my work today. And I love sitting with people in grief, giving them some kind of reassurance, some kind of like moment of feeling like they're going to make it through this.
I love that. I really love, again, like you have sections in the book that like if you're looking for ways to actively do something or to give, I mean, you just have, it's chalked with so much, so much helpful, practical, hopeful, reassuring, all of the things, seriously. And so
Thank
one
you.
thing
I definitely tried.
yeah, it's so good. And so I want to, like we've said a lot, I know, I really want to encourage everyone who's listening to, again, get a copy of Conscious Grieving. But I want, if you could, for you to leave the listeners with some words of hope and some more reassuring words.
Yeah,
If you could.
absolutely. I mean, people ask me all the time if this work is hard and sad, and that's the kind of outward perception. And yes, it can be, but it's also really beautiful. I think when we are in deep grief, we're meeting ourselves in our kind of purest form, our rawest form. And there's a lot of beauty in that. The conversations I have on a daily basis with my clients, they are in their most raw state of humanity, of who they are. And there's so much that we can learn about ourselves. And also, what I see in grief is that it's all about relationships and love. Even complicated relationships are still like this connectedness we have as humans to each other, which is so profound. And the grief comes from that. If we weren't connected to one another, we wouldn't be grieving. And there's so much beauty in that connection. So just trying to kind of see some of these different angles of it, I think can remind you that there is beauty to be found even in loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that so much. Yeah, I haven't thought about it in that way. That is like brings us to more of our rawest forms because we're, we're kind of like peeled back, right? Everything is kind of exposed. Oh, I love that imagery. Oh, so of course, like where can our listeners go to find all the things to find Conscious Grieving, your other 4 books, and all the resources that you have available?
Yeah, it's just clairebidwellsmith.com. I host online support groups, one-on-one sessions, grief retreats. I also train other therapists and clinicians in the field of grief. So it's all on the website, and I'm on social media, Instagram. I cannot get myself on TikTok. I keep trying. But I'm on Instagram and Facebook at our Claire Bidwell Smith.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire, for this time.
Thank you,
It has
Natasha.
been such a joy just to sit with you and chat with you about just all the things. Just your words are so rich and so needed in our world today. So again, my prayer is that everyone would go out and grab a copy of Conscious Grieving, as well as all of your other resources, and take advantage of those. So again, thanks for sitting with me.
Thank you so much for the beautiful work you're doing.
That brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks again for joining me, and thanks for listening to Can You Just Sit With Me? If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to come back for my next episode of Can You Just Sit With Me? Until then, this is Natasha Smith, helping you to find hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope in the challenging times of life. Be sure to connect with me across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at I'm Natasha Smith.